10 historical events that happened in March. When did Spanish flu start? What happened to the Lindbergh baby? And why did Mary order Thomas Granmer's execution? Here, Dominic Sandbrook explores 10 historical events that took place in March, 10 notable events that took place in March in history, from the Great Escape to the opening of the Eiffel Tower. March 1, 1932, the Lindbergh baby vanishes. On the evening of March 1, 1932, the pioneering aviator Charles Lindbergh was at home in New Jersey with his wife, Anne, and 20-month-old son, Charles Jr. At 7:30 p.m., a nanny laid the toddler down to sleep in his crib. About 2 hours later, Charles heard a noise he thought sounded like a crate smashing, but thought nothing of it. Then at 10 p.m., the nanny, frantic with worry, reported that the baby had disappeared. In his bedroom, Charles found a handwritten, misspelled note: "Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. We warn you from making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in good care." So began one of the most lurid cases in American criminal history. Amid massive publicity, crowds swiftly swarmed to the Lindbergh estate, destroying any chance of finding footprints. Amateur detectives, military men, and even Chicago mobsters offered their assistance. More ransom notes arrived. In early April, Lindbergh delivered $50,000 to the kidnapper via an intermediary, but there was no baby. Then, on 12th of May, a truck driver found a child's body in woods near Lindbergh's home. It was little Charles. 2 years later, the police arrested a German-born carpenter, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who had a record of robbery and whose garage contained notes from the ransom money. Protesting his innocence, he went to the electric chair. But many observers were convinced that he must have had help. And for the novelist Agatha Christie, the case inspired one of her greatest books, Murder on the Orient Express, number 2nd of March 537. Belisarius saves Rome from the Goths. In the first days of AD 537, the people of Rome waited nervously for attack. Once the capital of the world's greatest empire, now a miserable, ruined shadow, the ancient city had long since yielded its role to Constantinople. In the 5th century it had fallen to the Goths, but at the end of 536 it was retaken by Constantinople's greatest general, Belisarius. But since Belisarius had only a few thousand men, he knew he faced a struggle to keep it. At last, on the 2nd day of March, the enemy revealed themselves. From 7 great camps overlooking the city's main gates, the Goths began their siege of Rome. Equipped with vast siege engines, their armies were 10 times bigger than Belisarius's little band. But even as the city began to starve, Belisarius refused to panic. His secretary, Procopius, even recorded that the general laughed on seeing the Goths' great siege towers. He knew that reinforcements were on their way. All he had to do was wait. When peace talks broke down, Belisarius took the initiative, sending his general John to seize the towns in the Goths' rear. Some 374 days after the siege had begun, word reached the Goths that Rimini had fallen, leaving John barely a day's march from their capital, Ravenna. As smoke rose from the Goths' camps, Belisarius knew that his gamble had paid off. He waited until half the retreating Gothic forces were across the Milvian Bridge, and then ordered his troops out of the city. They killed thousands of Goths, and many more were drowned. Belisarius had won. For the time being at least, Rome remained Roman. March 4, 1918, Spanish flu strikes and kills 100 million. When Private Albert Gicciolo woke on Monday, March 4, 1918, he felt awful. A company cook at Fort Riley, Kansas, Gicciolo was supposed to be serving breakfast to hundreds of young American recruits, who were waiting to be shipped off to the battlefields of France. But when the doctors had a look at him, they realized that, with a temperature of more than 103, Jichel was in no state to work in the mess. A few hours later, another man, Corporal Lee Drake, appeared at the infirmary with similar symptoms. Then another, Sergeant Adolph Herbie. Still the men kept coming. There were 107 by lunchtime and more than 500 by the end of the week. By the end of the month, no fewer than 1,127 men at Fort Riley had come down with flu and 46 of them had died. In the next few months, as American soldiers flooded into Europe, they brought the deadly influenza with them. With vast armies surging across an exhausted continent, the conditions were perfect for a pandemic. This was one of history's deadliest disasters. Across the world, some 500 million people had been struck down by flu by the end of 1920, perhaps 100 million of them fatally. Many governments banned public gatherings or buried the victims in mass graves. Reporting restrictions in the combatant nations meant that the disease's progress in neutral Spain drew disproportionate attention, hence its nickname, Spanish flu. Only one populated part of the world reported no cases at all, the island of Marajo, at the mouth of the Amazon. March 5, 1946, Churchill warns of an Iron Curtain falling across Europe in the spring of 1946. Winston Churchill arrived in Fulton, Missouri. The little Midwestern town seemed an unlikely destination for the man who, until the previous summer, had been leading the world's largest empire. But Churchill, rejected by the British electorate, was in the doldrums. When President Harry Truman invited him to give a lecture at a little college in his home state, Churchill saw it as a chance to revive his American reputation. Churchill and Truman traveled to Fulton by train, and on the way the president read a draft of the former prime minister's talk. It was, he declared, excellent. But when Churchill stood up on 5th of March, in the packed gymnasium at Westminster College, few could have expected that his words would resound in history. A shadow, he explained, had fallen upon the scene so lately lighted by the Allied victory thanks entirely to Stalin's Soviet Union. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declared, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. That made Anglo-American cooperation all the more important. Theirs, Churchill added, was a special relationship. Churchill was not the first man to use the words Iron Curtain, but he was unquestionably the most famous. After that day in Fulton, there was no doubt that the alliance between Stalin's Soviet Union and the two great Western powers was over and that the Cold War had begun. 11th of March AD 222. Rome's Emperor of Excess meets a bloody end. Even in the lurid parade of Roman emperors, Elagabalus stands out. Born into the imperial Severan dynasty in c. 203 AD, he found himself catapulted to supreme power in his early teens and soon began to court controversy. To the horror of the Roman elite, their teenage emperor, whose real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, had signed up to the cult of the Syrian sun god Elagabalus, after whom he now named himself. Once emperor, he renamed his god Deus Sol Invictus, God the undefeated sun, and installed him at the head of the Roman pantheon. Then he declared himself high priest, had himself publicly circumcised, and made the city's bigwigs watch while he danced around the sun's new altar. In the meantime, Elagabalus's sexual conduct was raising eyebrows across the city. In total he married and divorced 5 women, but his chief relationships seem to have been with his chariot driver, a male slave called Hierocles, and an athlete from Asia Minor called Zodicus. According to gossip, the emperor set aside a room in the palace and there committed his indecencies, always standing nude at the door of the room, as the harlots do. While in a soft and melting voice he solicited the passers-by. If any doctor could give him female genitalia, he said, he would give him a fortune. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, sick of their emperor's excesses, switched their allegiance to his cousin Severus Alexander and turned on Elagabalus. As the historian Cassius Dio recorded, there was no mercy for either Elagabalus or his mother. Their heads were cut off and their bodies, after being stripped naked, were first dragged all over the city, and then the mother's body was cast aside somewhere or other while his was thrown into the river. This has been the top 5. See you on part 2. The top 6 to most historical happens on March. Thanks for watching.